And we're letting people in.
Oh.
Hello. My partner works as a preschool teacher for Zoom, and there's always like this soft opening while kids are like joining their Zoom calls. And I think about this a lot whenever I'm starting these events, because I'm like, everyone's still unmuting themselves. They're still audio joining. So we're always like, hello, hi, welcome to a McNally event.
Oh,
it's
so
charming
babies.
for all these people.
Oh, all right. I think we're just about ready to get started, and stragglers will join when they want to. So hi everyone. Welcome to the amazing book launch of Elaine Castillo's How to Read Now in conversation with Andrew Sean Greer. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. This is going to primarily be a reading and then an interview between Andrew and Elaine. And then in the last 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to do a little Q&A session. So just keep your questions in your mind, and you can either message them to the group chat, or you can privately message them to me if you prefer to keep anonymous. Yeah, so start thinking about that now. But for now, I'm going to start introducing our two esteemed guests. Elaine Castillo is named one of 30 of the planet's most exciting young people by the Financial Times. She was born and raised in the Bay Area. Her debut novel, America Is Not the Heart, was a finalist for numerous prizes, including the L. Big Book Award, the Center for Fiction Prize, and the Aspen Words Literary Prize, and was named the best book of 2018 by NPR, Real Simple, LitHub, the Boston Globe, San Francisco Chronicle, the New York Post, and the New York Public Library. And it has the coolest, all of the covers are so cool. I've like looked at all of the covers, even the UK edition, and I'm like, these covers go hard. So that's just my personal addition to the bio. So check out all the covers. You can see a variety of them online. Andrew Sean Greer is the author of 7 works of fiction, including the bestseller, The Confessions of Max Trevoli and Less. Greer has taught at a number of universities, including Stanford and the Iowa Writers Workshop, been a Today Show pick, a New York Public Library Cullman Center Fellow, and a judge for the National Book Award, and a winner of the California Book Award and New York Public Library Young Lions Award. He is a recipient of the NEA Grant, a Guggenheim Fellowship, and the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. He lives in San Francisco and Milan. His latest novel, Less is Lost, is out September 2022. So thank you both. Thank you both for joining us today. I know it's very hot where people are right now, but I would just love to hand it off to Andrew and just to get started.
Thank you, Brian. It's such a delight to be here with Elaine, who I have known for a while now, and who most recent. I'm in Italy right now. I'm in Milan. But the last time we saw each other, she made an amazing feast for 20 people, and there were 6 of us.
Just Filipino things.
Yeah. Love that.
Elaine, I have to say, as you know, I just ate this book up, and I was telling Ryan before that I reread it. I thought I'd skim over it before talking with you today, and I just spent the day rereading the whole thing. It's just so like gorgeously written, just from a writerly perspective. Like I was noticing choices you made that were so clever and just so intellectually profound and engaging. It's and just full of a like you know, I know you have like zero chill, as you say in the book, and it gives that completely. It's just, it has your personality completely. That's so, you know, I think what is interesting is that it's full of the same joy you have about books and about reading, you know, that you give off. And I just think that's wonderful. And it was your father who introduced you to books.
Yes. Well, before I get into my father and obviously start crying over that, let's start crying over something else, which is that obviously I'm super, super happy to be here with McNally Jackson, legendary, but to be here with Andy, also legendary. That the story of that dinner party, which absolutely, I cooked food for 20 people, and I think there was like 6 to 8 of us there. But what I remember most from that dinner party was I was starting to freak out and have anxiety about overfeeding people as usual and being overbearing as usual. And all I remember is Andy spooning, like, I think chicken sisig into tacos and being like, don't give up, don't give up, don't give up. And that encapsulates our friendship. That kind of support and love and belief and don't give up. And I mean, you know, it's your friends when they say your book is giving zero chill. So I'm very happy to be here and happy to be celebrating with Andy. And yeah, I mean, I have stories to tell about the first time I met Andy, but we'll get to that later. But yes, it was my father who introduced me to books. I think my father who was probably the first person who put a book in my hand, I think. And I think because of that, you know, like I talk about a little bit in the book, the way that we read, because my father in his previous life, he was a surgeon, an orthopedic surgeon, but he was 54 by the time that I was born. So he was in his entirely, I mean, not just second life, but sort of third or fourth life. And he was a security guard. And so the way we found books or looked at books was we would go to Goodwill, we would go to the local library, we would, you know, sort of, it was a kind of scavenger, very idiosyncratic, you know, and he didn't have a English or literary background at all. He was just someone who loved books, who loved reading. And he passed that very weird way of reading down to me. But I think I was also always aware because of my father's class background, because he, you know, unlike my mother, he came from a very kind of upper middle class background in the Philippines. My mother came from, you know, rural poverty, where still to this day, her kind of hold on literacy is very sort of shaky or uncertain. So I think I also had a sense that reading, that my love of reading was also class inflected. And I think I did want to talk about that also, especially in a book that, you know, wants to talk about reading in such a holistic way, to talk about not just, you know, reading or independent bookstores or, you know, the kind of bourgeois liberal leisure activity way of thinking about reading, but, you know, how we read Marvel, how we read books, I mean, how we read movies, how we read, you know, signage on national monuments, all of those things. I think those are the kind of freewheeling way of reading is really what he passed down to me.
And well, because I mean, in the book, you pierce a lot of the fantasies that Americans are given in the classroom about how to read. But it sounds like you talk about that your father and you read not in a white centering way, that it was a sort of decolonializing way to read as a young person.
I think so. And I don't even know that he would have had the language exactly or the vocabulary to say it like that, because we did read a lot of, I mean, he loved, you know, he made me read sort of Plato and James Joyce and, like, I mean, Thomas Mann he really loved for some reason. Like, he really loved, like, Death in Venice, which I was like,
Death in
obvious.
Venice?
I was like, don't be surprised that you now have a bisexual child. But, you know, Death in Venice and all of that, you know, all of that you know, he had such a distinct and kind of, in a way, unacademic take on books. It came from such a place of passion, such a passion, and also so personal. And I think that's how I came to it also, that, you know, that I could kind of read anything. And that also that, you know, there wasn't this sense of, oh, I'm reading this because I identify with this character, or I'm reading this because it's great literature that I have to read. It was just sort of, you know, I think the way I describe it in the book is that, you know, you read and you encounter things, episodes, characters, people that are fragile and mysterious and beautiful in the same way that I was allowed to believe that I was also fragile and mysterious and beautiful.
Well, you talk a lot about, I think the most interesting myth that you pierce is the myth that we read books to have empathy for someone other than ourselves. And you recenter it as being about, like, you read books because it is about you, you know, it's not about some other person. Now, when did you reach a point of maybe crisis where you left that way of reading that felt natural and came into conflict with this other standardized way of reading that we all that I have.
I think, yeah, I think
So
there
I'm-
were, I think there were stages. I mean, certainly when at school is one of the, kind of primordial places where you encounter a specific kind of pedagogy about, oh, we're going, oh, okay, a pedagogy about how to read or what reading means, or, I think I remember that I would turn in kind of book reports about the things that I was reading, and just teachers wouldn't believe it. I would get like F's or C's, or go down, it's done. We don't, very athletic. That, so there was I think I remember I was telling someone recently that I just remember that I used to make up age appropriate books that I would then write book reports about, so that my teachers would believe that she reads this kind of book. And now when I look back on it, I'm like, oh, wow, that was my first clue that I was a writer. Because I was sort of making up these sort of make-believe YA or
Wait, you
children's.
made up the books completely?
I would just made up a book completely. I'd be like, oh, there's a murder mystery. So I read this book and I would make up the author name and the title, and then I would write a report about it. And then my teacher would be like, oh yeah, okay, this is great, A or whatever. But if I said it was, Plato or something, they were like, you didn't read this, so F. So I literally, that came back like a flashback in an interview last week. So there was that aspect, I had the sense. I mean, obviously, looking back on it now, that sense was ultimately racialized, that there was, because the majority of my teachers, certainly in the Catholic schools that I attended to, were white. So there was this, sense that we don't believe that, this child is reading these books. So that was a part of it. But I think also, what plays into, I think every writer knows that your relationship to reading is somehow forever transformed the minute you publish your first book, because bookstores are no longer this place of like, oh, refuge and everything. I don't have any associations with, how the sausage is made. But then, you publish a book, and then it does transform your relationship. But I think how I started to see the way the books of writers of color were being framed in our kind of mainstream literary discourse, or even what passes for progressive literary discourses, versus how the books of white writers were being framed, that started to feel to me undeniable, unavoidable, and it just started to seem like, well, I'm gonna have to write about this, otherwise I can't continue in this industry.
Well, you do an amazing takedown of Peter Handke. That is in real depth. I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating to go at the sentence level in German, in the English translation, but to go after the German original for how it meant. I mean, do you think being a writer gave you even more insight into how those choices are made?
Sure. Yeah. I think I've always loved close line reading, and I never really understood why it was always called that way, close line reading, because in my head I was always like, well, isn't that just reading? The lines are there, so you're supposed to read them. But I mean, with Peter Handke, in my more bullshit moments, I think I did tell to someone, oh yeah, the energy of this book is we're just gonna take down a Nobel Prize winner in his native language. But my partner is a German speaker, so I had some help on that front. So German and French have been part of my life, for multiple familial or personal or amorous reasons. But yeah, I think, like I say in the essay, I was also a reader of Handke. I was a reader of a lot of Austrian writers because my dad loved Thomas Mann and Goethe, and I was like, oh well, I'm not going to love the same German language writers as you. I'm going to find my own German language writers, which is why I started reading, Austrian writers like Thomas Bernhard and Elfriede Jelinek and Peter Handke, and really, I remember really being fascinated and enamored as a reader by a lot of those stories. So I think it's then when I would read, articles that would talk about Peter Handke's work in a way that to me evinced no experience of reading Peter Handke's work, it just is a disconnect for me. I'm like, well, you're talking about Peter Handke, and I'm so glad that I can read him. He's a non-political writer. Well, have you read him? Sorry.
You write it a few times in the book that you don't want to remove these books from the shelves, that you just think that this is reading. This is, because in a way, it's the kind of conversation that any of us would have sitting together over a bottle of wine. If we'd read Peter Handke, you know, it.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I'm not interested in that kind of censorship or that kind of I think it's just a panic button that kind of reactionary commentators like to push a lot when they're like, oh, well, if you talk about the fact that it's political, then we're going to cancel it, and then we're going back to it's witch hunts, and then it's book burning. I was like, fam, no one is saying that. Please chill. Also, like, like, you know, and it also is such a it's such a bad, you know, it's not an argument that's being had in good faith, because it's saying, it's tantamount to saying, oh, well, let's read these articles critically, is, you know, somehow a huge affront to one's kind of artistic sensibilities. But, you know, I think that's not doing the stuff of what it is to be a reader. It's I mean, just in the most basic sense. Even if you think you love Peter Handke, if you love him, don't you do him the disservice? Don't you do him the, you know, the service? Shouldn't you do him the service of actually reading his books, actually reading what he has to say? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, that's what it is to be a reader. So I think, you know, I also don't have, I think a lot of our pieties around reading, and, you know, this goes back also to the kind of cliche that reading teaches us empathy, is that I think a lot of us really want to labor under the impression that if we like something, therefore it must be good, which is to say, if we like something, therefore it must be good, it must make us good. And I think it's harder for us to contend with the thornier fact that there are things that we might like or resonate with that are complex, that are morally ambiguous, that are politically repugnant, and we have to also confront those places in ourselves. I think the reason I have trouble with the idea that reading teaches us empathy is not because I'm not discounting the, you know, project of empathy in like humankind, but because those kind of false pieties make us, what it ends up being is that we ends up going to certain readers, which is largely writers of color, or we end up going to certain writers, largely writers of color, immigrant writers, queer writers, marginalized writers, because we want to learn something, because we empathize so much with them. But we never talk about the fact that being told to read Peter Handke in a non-political way is itself a project of empathy. That's telling us, well, let's empathize with these white supremacist characters in ways that make no mention of their belief system, of the way they view the world, of the harm that they do to others. Then no one is saying that is also a project of empathy, that is also obligating empathy from us in a very specific political and, in its own way, politically radical way.
I feel like maybe now it's a good time to hear something from the book, in fact.
I think I was probably just reciting by memory part of the.
I know it's like, exactly your voice. I think it'll go perfectly.
That is very good timing. Okay, let's read. Well, since we're talking about the Peter Handke, let's read from that one.
Great.
Let me see. So I might skip around a little bit just for the purposes of, you know, reading aloud, but just not to bore you with, you know, 3,000 words about Jane Austen. Although I probably at least 1,500 words.
I love the Jane Austen. But anyway.
Okay, so this is from an essay called "Reading Teaches Us Empathy and Other Fictions." People often say that art builds our empathy. Reading, in particular. It's one of those feel-good lines that gets trotted out at literary readings, writing festivals, panel discussions on diversity in fiction, in classrooms, on book jackets, book reviews, book blurbs, not to mention in uncomfortably long discussions with white people who read your book and want you to know for sure that they're not racist. When we read books about immigration, our exposure to the toil of good, hardworking immigrants makes us more empathetic to their plight, and so on, for books about queer people and books about slavery, etc. Diverse books are empathy machines, or so the received wisdom would have us believe. Like Trinity in the Matrix, we can upload a book's world into ourselves and feel our empathy skills powering up, juicing through the veins. I use the impoverished term diverse books deliberately here because it's the books that fall under the rubric of diversity that are the ones most often prescribed to us as empathy boosters. Books built for purpose. But the idea that fiction builds empathy is one of incomplete politics. left hanging by probably good intentions. The concept of instrumentalizing fiction or art as a kind of ethical protein shake, such that reading more and more diversely will somehow build the muscles in us that will help us see other people as human, makes a kind of superficial sense and produces a superficial effect. The problem with this type of reading is that in its practical application, usually readers are encouraged by well-meaning teachers and lazy publishing copy to read writers of a demographic minority in order to learn things, which is to say, as a supplement for their empathy muscles, a metabolic exchange that turns writers of color into little more than ethnographers, personal trainers, to continue the metaphor. The result is that we largely end up going to writers of color to learn the specific and go to white writers to feel the universal. The problem is, if we need fiction to teach us empathy, we don't really have empathy because empathy is not a one-stop destination. It's a practice, ongoing, which requires work from us in our daily lives, for our daily lives, not just when we're confronted with a visibly and legibly other, not just when a particularly gifted author has managed to make a community story come alive for the reader who's come for a quick zoo visit, always remaining on her side of the cage. However, the annoying problem with pushing back against the self-serving platitudes of fiction as empathy machine is that sometimes you run into people who disdain the value of empathy in art for entirely different, but equally self-serving reasons. The art for art's sake gang, here to rout out political correctness, save literature, and make sure we all have the right to keep reading the same white Europeans forevermore. This squad has no time for diverse books as empathy machines either, not because the practice bowdlerizes the work of minoritized writers about whom the art for art's sake gang could generally care less, but because to this regime of thought, any consideration of identity or empathy, or indeed being in any way consciously political in one's art making and one's art consumption, necessarily diminishes and cheapens our relationship to that art. This particularly strident Hogwarts house protests against the relationship between fiction and empathy, not because of the unequal distribution of burden it places on writers of color versus white writers, but because prioritizing empathy through fiction gets in the way of a reader's supposedly pure relationship to that author's art, its apparently sacred, non-political storytelling force. I'm reminded of a New York Times opinion piece by Bret Stephens, written after the controversial awarding of the Nobel Prize to casually fascist stylist Peter Handke, the Austrian writer known both for his spare epigrammatic texts and for his fervently pro-Serbian stance with regard to the violent collapse of the former Yugoslavia and his denial of the genocide of Bosnian Muslims at the hands of Serbian forces, showing his support by, among other things, famously attending the funeral of Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic, the first sitting head of state to be charged for war crimes. The New York Times piece defended those who would continue to read the Austrian's work with the passion typical of people whose commitment to art is such that it compels them to defend white fascists and their apologists. What's the alternative? Those who think that a core task of art is political instruction or moral uplift will wind up with some version of socialist realism or religious dogma. And those who think that the worth of art must be judged according to the moral and political commitments of its creator ultimately consign all art to the dustbin, since even the most avant-garde artists are creatures of their time. This is the white liberal argument that characterizes much of our reading culture, that there is a fundamental binary between political art and the real art that transcends such dogma, such instruction, such moralizing. The panic here is that art, true art, our tragic and ever far Dulcinea, may be under siege from the contaminating force of the polity and its concerns, that indeed we risk losing all art, throw it straight in the garbage bin, if we ever dare to ask art to be more than it is, to do more than what it ought to do. The problem is, this panic defensiveness rarely seems to actually know what it wants the art to be, what it wants art to do. This paranoid testudo formation rarely seems to have a handle on what reading, and in particular critical reading, actually consists of. Sure, critical reading is an intellectual exercise, an aesthetic exercise, and a profoundly private, emotional, and visceral undertaking, while also being an ethical act, a civic act. It is all these things at once. Books ask us to live this multiplicity every single time we open them. But there's often a conservative, reactionary resistance to the expansive multiplicity, and specifically inclusivity, of critical readings, which encompasses post-colonial readings, queer readings, what's sometimes pejoratively called anachronistic readings. The argument usually goes something along the lines of, we can't apply contemporary political worldviews onto older texts because the world was different then. Deciding whether I'm going to read the Austen bit or skip ahead. Oh, wait. Because the world was different then. Sure, it was. But it also wasn't, is the thing. The lives of the characters in Jane Austen's novels will always be entwined with Britain's empire and slave economy. That was always the case. Slavery and the capitalist extraction of resources from Caribbean colonies were banal and foundational facts of life in Austen's era, and that ubiquity does not erase the world-rending evil those practices represented, nor does it invalidate the minutely drawn humanity of the specific parts of her world Austen was able to recognize and bring to life. Although, as Montclair State University professor and scholar of British abolitionist literature Patricia Matthews has deftly pointed out, the canonization of Austen, whose fiction played with, but ultimately conformed to, the social conventions of her time, throws into relief the fact that many of Austen's less passionately remembered contemporaries did in fact write about race and interracial marriages that were not tucked away in Charlotte Bronte's attic. Rejecting contemporary discussions of race when it comes to Austen's work also masks the fact that political debates about abolition among wealthy, educated whites, especially the white women who were both Austen's subject and audience, were by no means exceptional. Austen's, not to mention Elizabeth Bennet's, contemporaries were known to have circulated petitions, raised funds for the cause, and boycotted sugar from the West Indies. Even Wedgwood, famed purveyor of teacups to many a well-heeled character from Austen to Bridgerton, as well as any self-respecting cottagecore picnic bitch influencer, produced teapots and cameo medallions and sugar bowls decorated with abolitionist artwork and slogans due to founder Josiah Woodward's membership in the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, while of course, also producing tea services that celebrated Britain's naval might and seafaring heroes, demurely declining to elaborate just to what purpose and laden with what cargo these great ships, immortalized in bone china and creamware, once sailed. In fine-combing the political nuances and limitations of the era's gendered economies, Matthews draws our attention to a dynamic that echoes Toni Morrison's diagnosis of the way white selfhood was necessarily illuminated by casting Blackness as its shadow. The Regency construction of white womanhood, the deliberate signals sent by its purchasing tastes, the nobility of its humanitarian and proto-feminist endeavors, necessitated, literally served up, a subaltern Black subject for the liberal white woman to save, consume, and ultimately absorb into the drama of her own political enlightenment. TLDR, a contemporary Austen character would wear that Dior feminist slogan t-shirt. Thus, the complicated political substance of an abolitionist teapot cannot be divorced from its time period. Most of all, the Regency teapot cannot be divorced from its users, largely women who not only cast themselves as righteous protagonists in the political theater accessorized by these objects, the better word here may be props, but also crucially delighted in the objects and the rituals they enshrined, in the complex seductions and pleasures of their material objecthood. Fundamentally, these objects were meant to be enjoyed as aesthetically beautiful, commercially desirable, and morally edifying, all at once. Not unlike some books. All this to say, continuing to read Austen's work does not require the zero-sum feat of intellectual gymnastics that the art for art's sake gang seems to fear. Acknowledging the truth of colonialism and the slave trade in Austen's era is no vandalizing act of literary deletion, but an act of literary expansion and restoration, not to mention the barest concession to reality. If anything, it's quite a politically radical reading to argue that race did not exist as a subject of contemplation in Austen's world, as bizarre as arguing that it does not exist as a subject of contemplation in ours. To suggest, I'll skip ahead. For myself, Stevens continues in his New York Times article, I plan to add one or two of Handke's books to my shelf, at least the non-political ones. They'll sit alongside Pinter, Saramago, Grass, and of course Dahl, writers to whom I will always feel grateful, not least because they did not choose politics as their vocation. This sanctimonious caping for the depoliticization of our art is a fundamental misunderstanding of the relationship between art, politics, and vocation, not to mention a clear indication of just which demographic of writers, judging by the white European men listed, this particular article is so at pains to defend. It's not without some irony that I look around and note that the writers and artists who are the most disdainful of art's edifying function The people who seem most openly suspicious of and threatened by the idea of politics in fiction, or indeed empathy building in fiction, are also the people who have historically benefited the most from the universal goodwill and empathy that is afforded someone living in a cis white middle-class body. Because what more powerful empathy machine do we have than heteropatriarchal white supremacy? I didn't even have to grow up in a town with actual white people for my indoctrination into American civic life on every level to feel like a never-ending empathy drill for white supremacy. The main characters in nearly every book we were assigned, in nearly every primetime TV show on television, in nearly every movie in the local movie theater, in nearly every state and federal government position. But no one ever told us that we were being shown these books and movies to build our empathy. This was just the inherited status quo of consumption and interpretation that came with a 24-hour cycle of saturation in white-centered, imaginative, intellectual, and moral narrative life. The genre I still jokingly call white people having feelings. So much of the hand-wringing around reading and censorship in the contemporary age asks us to believe that we're all coming to art as both equal consumers of art and equal subjects of art. That it is the same thing to tell writers of color that they cannot identify with white characters, a common pressure point that those terrified by political correctness often jab at like a panic button, as it is to tell white writers that they cannot write characters of color. Ditto. But no one ever told me that my heart couldn't throb in tune with Maggie's in George Eliot's The Mill on the Floss. Western education is precisely about asking everyone to make this imaginative leap in the name of art. A leap almost always into unnamed and transcendent whiteness. It is not remotely a risky defense of our art to protect that leap or to maintain a status quo that ensures the leap will always be unidirectional. So when the works of authors like Handke, Pinter, Saramago, and Grass are seen and interpreted as dealing with a universally legible and graciously apolitical soulfulness, and resolutely not seen and interpreted as also being the identity politics driven work of a specific white milieu, what we're really offering them is that precious empathy, which white supremacy levies from us every day and never has to name.
It's just fantastic. And I have to say, intimidating reading it, because I just thought how so carefully researched and thought through it all was. I can't imagine being able to put something together as erudite as this.
No.
I think I wanted to follow that amazing reading by I think there's a chapter in your book that was really interesting to me about the unexpected reader, and the moment where you found that you were the unexpected reader. That there are books written not thinking that you're going to read it, because I've had that experience myself. I think it was just last week I read a book and I was like, oh, ouch. Oh, I didn't expect that character to be there. You didn't think I was going to read this. Ooh, damn it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't even think I can come up with a time where I realized that was what I was. I think that was what I was from the beginning. But it's pronounced when you come across a book that, you know, is suddenly talking about Filipino women, and you're like, oh, you guys are just talking amongst yourselves. This is literally locker room talk that I'm now stumbling upon, but I was not expecting, you know, my presence was not expected within, you know, this space. I mean, I think one of the reasons I think about it is because sometimes when I read some of the contemporary literary discourse and the resistance to, you know, reading literary criticism that, you know, in any way evinces a political inflection or a post-colonial inflection, or, you know, the kind of resistance to critical race theory, things like that, I think that does it does feel like it's coming from people who have never experienced being unexpected in a book, who have never experienced being estranged in a book. Whereas my feeling of reading was one of almost constant estrangement. And like I say in the essays, I just had to get used to it, that, you know, so reading was not this place where I could go to feel like, oh, well, everyone's going to look like me and sound like me and be like me. So sometimes when I think, you know, when people resist this idea, I was like, oh, well, if you if you don't separate the art and the artist, you know, what's going to happen then? And I won't be able to enjoy reading this book, or I won't be able to feel comfortable, or I'll be affected. And it's like, I'm sorry, is that a new feeling for you to have to juggle those complex feelings in your mind when you read a book? Because that's literally the experience that I have for every single book. And for me, I think I've come to realize how much a gift that is, how much a privilege because of that, because I never was in any kind of, as I say in the essays, I was never in any assumed complicity with a book. So it forced me to practice a kind of openness, to practice a kind of constant complexity, and to have to live with that, you know, in anything that I read or in any movies that I watched. And as I say in the essay, I think it's a curse really to not go through that, or to be only going through that now, to feel like, oh, well, wait, are you saying that I can't read Pablo Neruda because he literally described in his memoirs that he raped a Sri Lankan chambermaid while he was a diplomat there? Well, yeah, fam.
Yeah, I mean, I found that description of like actually incredibly generous as a way of talking about the way to read now as embracing the complexity of it. I thought that was, because you so clear, there's so many books I have on my shelf that I feel crazy about. I love them, but they're messed up, you know? And I'm comfortable talking about the complexity of that. Like some of them I read too early to really get it, but some of them I read, a lot of Philip Roth novels I read enough to be like, I cannot, some of them I couldn't finish, but some I was like, this is a great writer and I'm enjoying it. And I got
if my agent's listening to this, if my agent's listening to this, Emma, my agent, who is also a woman of color, is a big Philip Roth person, and I think goes through the same thing. She's getting me into Philip Roth. I'm starting to read. I've read a couple, but I haven't fully gotten into the earth. But yeah, no, I
hit The Human Stain, like it's an amazing book, and it's rough too, and it's an interesting place to sit as a reader.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, well, that's really the gift of reading in that way, of you know, not reading. I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about this idea that I think some of us really think like, well, because I like something, therefore it's good. And we have that kind of moralizing, that moral relationship to what I like. And if something is bad, and if I like it, well, then doesn't that make me bad? And you know, that we have that kind of binary, as opposed to thinking, well, yeah, there's parts in these books that are really messed up and they resonate with me. That might mean that parts of me resonate with something that's messed up. I might have to confront parts of myself that are also messed up. And I think that's harder for people. I mean, that's harder for anyone to contend with, to wrestle with, to sit with, the parts of you that, you know, I was thinking about this when I was thinking about the, you know, books that I've loved that maybe have been have had like misogynist descriptions or descriptions that I think I can't remember now which book I was thinking of. And then I thought, well, I mean, I'm not interested in saying, well, I love that book despite those things, and in doing so then exonerating myself from having to contend with, or implicate myself in having to contend with loving that book. I think it also confront some internalized misogyny, or at least at the very least, you know, a capacity in me to excuse, you know, the same way that sometimes when you're in a group or with your relatives and someone will say something absolutely fucking wild, and you won't always be like, that's fucking out of order, cousin or uncle, or, you know, I think though we live in those complexities. I mean, some of us do. I mean, I definitely get into a lot of fights, which I'm sure this book doesn't makes no indication that would be my personality trait. But you know, I think I that's something I was thinking about recently, how it also forces me to recognize the parts of myself that share, ways of thinking about the world, ways of thinking about women, ways of thinking about myself that are not wholly, morally upright or aggrandizing or, edifying or, positive.
I think I should remind the people watching that this is the moment to put in the chat some questions for Elaine. And to buy some time, I'm gonna fulfill a promise and talk about when we met in Australia and New Zealand, because New Zealand is a big party book. It's so interesting to have read that after having been there with you, that it made such an impression on you. You did such deep research about it.
Oh yeah, massive. Well, I will tell a story. I think we were there. I was talking to someone and I was talking about it as being like the Sydney Auckland Writers Festival class of 2019. Because that all of us, I think a lot of us have kept in touch. We still like write each other and text each other. And so that was where I met you. I met your partner. And I remember I went to one of your events. Well, first, I think I remember I was writing. I was in some writing field just because, New Zealand or Aotearoa was doing such a number on my head, and I was spending time in the hotel room. I was just writing stuff. And then I came out and I was in a fugue, and you were in this beautiful red suit, like a vision. And I was like, this is when you want to dream of what like a writer looks like, or will have, the magnetism and the aura. I was like, that's the ideal. And then you had the event. I think it was that day you had an event and you were talking about less, which I read after we met and after the festival, and became one of my favorite books. I mean, I was talking with Ryan and Andy before this event started about how I fully ugly sobbed when reading that, and how Les is just one of my favorite characters. But I remember something that you said during I think it was in Auckland during one of your panel discussions, and I think they were asking sort of why you had written the book, and I think the question was around aging, and you had said, oh gosh, now I feel like I'm going to paraphrase you, so I'm sorry for that, but you'd said something really beautiful about how you wanted to see queer men aging. You wanted to see a depiction of particularly gay men aging because you hadn't had the experience of seeing the generation above you age. And I remember being in the audience, just being in sort of floods of tears. And even now, as I'm saying it, I was like, oh, it was a mistake to tell this story one glass of champagne in. But I remember that because that love and that the humor and the defiance of the romance and the survival in us, that your answer there, I felt that resonating throughout the book. This has nothing to do.
Get out of you, but that's very sweet. That's very. No, I think both of us were really astounded by New Zealand. It was such a contrast to Australia, but you.
Sorry, Australians.
Australians, we loved it there.
We love you.
New Zealand was really a very, of course, as you go to a different country, it was a different country.
It's a different country. Yeah, no, I think I did have one of those sort of somewhat epiphanic, I think, experiences in New Zealand that, you have sometimes, not all the times. And I was really very wary because as I was going through it, I was like, oh God, I don't want to be going through some like weird eat, pray, love thing, like rein it in. This could be problematic. And I think also, it's true that New Zealand plays such a very big role in this essay collection, in particular, in one essay in particular. I think also recently I've been thinking about the genre of travel writing and how fraught that genre is, just because travel writing is it obviously has sort of colonial histories and kind of neo-colonial histories, this idea of like our man in Havana, or, like the sort of white traveler that goes to the exotic place and then, writes back to everyone back home about all the mangoes or whatever, that sort of. But then also there's the, tradition of travel writing of, someone like James Baldwin, who wrote about Paris and France and Switzerland and was able to write about a place that was foreign to him, or a place where he was an outsider, in ways that illuminated that place, but also illuminated his relationship to home, to, America. So I think at least I hope that's what I'm able to convey in the essay that's about New Zealand, that I did have what felt like a very, yeah, I think somewhat a kind transformative or an altering experience there, but one that I think, you know, I mean, the documentary that I talk about, which is about the Maori filmmaker Merata Mita, documentary filmmaker, you know, the things that I experienced in New Zealand were also things that illuminated my relationship as a, you know, as someone who, you know, the settler colonial history of California, as someone who grew up in California, and also the kind of indigenous history and the history around climate justice in nature and the racialized history of climate justice in nature in the Philippines, you know, and it allowed me to see connections in ways that I don't think I would have had I not gone there. So, you know, there is hope for travel, yet it can also expand and open your mind. Those cliches are true.
Well, maybe the cliche is that it is a mirror on yourself in some way, you know,
Yeah.
and it looks at it's, or a mirror on the things you care about deeply that are unexpressible in their most obvious form, that become clarified by the place you go to, where they're talking about the same things in a different way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I hiked in New Zealand. I'm not a hiker in California. That was also a new thing. I suddenly was
You're not
hiking in New
hiking
Zealand. I was
California.
like, who is this new girl, new phone? And so, you know, all those kinds of things, the way it introduced me to.
We have some questions coming in.
Okay.
Here's one from Kat Rakelin. Did you consider publishing any of these essays individually, or did you always think of writing them as a book of essays?
I that's a really good question. I to be honest, no. And the reason is that I am not very good in short form. I mean, I don't think I've been I was talking about this recently to someone, and I'm very bad with excerpting things. I'm very bad with excerpting things. I'm very bad with, I think I'm bad with short form. That's why I love poetry so much, because it just boggles my mind that people are able to write short form. So for me, the way my brain works really is in the form of a book. So, you know, when people would excerpt things, I'd be like, oh, but wait, you need the context that it's about Austin, and there's this whole digression on teapots, and, you know, obviously that sounds unhinged as I say this, but that's I mean, that really is how my brain works. So I think because the essays are so interconnected and to me feels like they build on each other, even the excerpt, I think there are some excerpts being published now, and I'm very grateful for the excerpts being published now, but there's also some part of me like, but there's the John Berger thing, there was more about the, you know, so I think it's better for my sanity that I not, that I stay in
John
book form.
Berger, I know there's more to say for you.
A fellow Scorpio with you. Love this for you guys.
Here's Sarah Leonard says, happy pub day, Elaine. How to Read Now is such a special read in so many ways, but one of my favorite parts of the book is the humor. How did you go about incorporating humor while writing about these serious topics? That's a good question.
Oh, I think, well, Sarah knows my commitment to humor is you know, probably, I mean, is not always well advised. Do anything for the bit. Is that the like comedian? I mean, I think for, you know, I think for me, there is a kind of colloquial way that I, in a both in an intellectual sense and in an ethical sense, that I like the shape of my thoughts to take. And maybe that's because, you know, I didn't come from two, you know, parents that were professors or academics, and so constantly trafficked in academic language, or I didn't grow up in a context where, you know, well, everyone had a certain way of conveying their intellectual thoughts, and it was all very serious, and you had a certain kind of bourgeois way of expression, or you know, all the kind of gatekeeping around what language, what constitutes intellectual language. I mean, I just grew up with people who just roasted each other all the time. So I think that's the only way I know how to function. And of course, you know, I think I'm also aware of all the places where humor for me is a deflection move. I mean, I think I talk about it a little bit in the Didion essay, or in the part of the Didion essay where I talk about the poetry of Tommy Pico and how funny he is, and how I recognize, I mean, he talks also about how humor is these ways of kind of deflecting pain or deflecting blows. And so I'm conscious of that also. I tried to be conscious of the places where I was being funny, to maybe deflect, but also keep those places in, because those are also honest to my, you know, emotional or intellectual path, or the shape of my thinking. There are places where sometimes I'll crack a joke to leaven, you know, the mood, or to lighten the space, or to, and I think for both of those ways of using humor are important to me.
Teresa Gaffney has a question. Elaine,
Hi, Teresa.
5 question marks. Shop question for you, smiley face. How do you think today's publishing industry reinforces the ideas you write about in Reading Teaches Us Empathy and Other fictions, especially these ideas of diverse books teaching us something, yet the depoliticization of white writing? And do you have any ideas on how or if it can change? Complicated question.
just an easy question from Teresa. No, I love you, Teresa. I love you. Just an easy question from Teresa about, you know, how to revolutionize this entire publishing industry. Is that it?
Yeah, she says, I love you in her comment.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, as I talk about mainly in the Reading Teaches Us Empathy, which I think is the essay that talks most in a kind of shop way about the function, or the functions that writers of color are being tasked to perform in our intellectual discourse, in our intellectual culture, especially in a culture which is really like, we're creating these sort of cottage industries about how to teach white people to be better, or how to, you know, how to teach white people to be anti-racist, and it's the day. I mean, I'm glad that those books exist. I'm glad that those writers are getting paid. I'm glad that you know, that there's a willingness to learn. I think what I'm wary about is the idea, because there's obviously, I mean, as we've all, I think we're all aware of, there's also an enormous reactionary backlash to that idea. And the backlash is also, in a way, enabled by this dividing up of labor, where writers of color are the ones who are supposed to be like, well, this is how we teach, you know, this, and then everyone else gets to do art, right? Everyone else is just doing sort of pure art. So obviously, when you have that kind of false division of labor, you'll have people that will be like, oh, well, you've introduced what, I mean, people now use woke like a slur. I mean, that's obviously, you know, that's a real red flag when someone starts being like, oh, the woke mob is coming for us, you know. So I think in some ways it's, for example, recently I've been thinking about the concept of sensitivity readers. And I mean, I'm very glad that they exist, obviously, but sometimes I wonder, I have a little issue with calling them sensitivity readers, because I think that invites people to be like, oh, well, everyone's a snowflake who reads now, and now we need to, everyone who has problems with white supremacy, with transphobia, with homophobia, with, you know, fucking class elitism, they're just being sensitive, and now we have to have sensitivity readers to read for them. I think it's, you know, it would get to the point better to be like, well, we have someone reading to make sure that there's someone there to confront you about potentially being a fucking white supremacist. I'm not saying that we'll take those points out, but if you've never had anyone confront, you know, the ideas that in your book, and fam, this is white supremacist propaganda that you are propagating here, that to me does not constitute sensitivity reading. That to me constitutes like basic equity, basic discourse.
I hope we can imagine a future not so far away where it's just readers. That's a reader.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. I think we're all tasked with that problem. Yeah. And of course, the idea that sensitivity readers potentially should be by and large readers of color, for example, that it's somehow readers of color that are invested with this kind of special knowledge that will then Christian or you know, allow people through the gate of, oh, okay, not okay, no, and that kind of burden is then placed on readers of color. I think I was talking about this. I think my editor, who is a white editor, who's white, and I love her. Hi, Laura, I love you. She was talking about this because we were talking about, I think people were asking me to, in the way that they often ask writers of color to comment on something, you know, something terrible and racist that was happening in the zeitgeist, you know, the one time that happens. And Laura said something, you know, said something brilliant, which is typical of her. Said, why do they always ask writers of color to ask this? Why don't they ask the white editor of that piece to write a critical piece about why that piece was published? Why don't you ask literally anyone else? Why is that task to writers of color to then be attack dogs for, you know, oh, you've got something to say for this terrible thing that happened in the culture? You know, so how writers of color are then weaponized in that type of industry is also something to be aware of.
Well, I think our time is up. There's so much more to
There's so
say.
much more to say.
Luckily, I get to say with you later. But everyone else gets to hear it from you when they buy the book.
Yes, I'm going to post it one more time in the chat before, and be sure to stay tuned for Andrew's book as well. We were just talking about how amazing that is. But for now, you can buy both books. You can pre-order Andrew's book. You can buy Elaine's book. I don't know if you can pre-order it right now, but you can buy Elaine's book and you can put it on your calendar to pre-order Andrew's book. And yeah, so thank you so much for both of you. And I think we're all good to go, actually. So thank you both so much for everything.
Everyone for coming.
Ryan, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Andy, I love you. Thank you so much for doing this in Italy, in the hail. Thank you so much.
Oh no. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you everyone for coming. Hi Harry, I love you.
Good night, everyone. Good day.